My name is Jeff Morgan. I am from Dallas, Texas. I will be speaking on the topic of grandparent alienation. On June 14th, 2018, many people throughout the country will be gathering for the third annual Grandparent Alienation Awareness Day. What is grandparent alienation? Grandparent alienation is when a grandchild's mother or father usually put up barriers to the children from having a strong relationship with their grandparents. Unfortunately, too often today, we overemphasize parental rights to the exclusion of grandparents. Somehow grandparents in our mind don't have a crucial role. Somehow they are the additional add-ins that are nice if they obey the parents, and that's it. Dr. Roma Hanks, a PhD, in the late 1990s wrote about the role of grandparents for this upcoming century. She stated, "It is my belief that grandparenting is the most important family role of the new century." I say that because grandparents are just now discovering all the possibilities of relating to their grandchildren. Whether they are providing full-time care or working on a deeply supportive relationship, grandparents will have influence over a longer period of their grandchildren's lives than ever before. They will be healthier, more active, more involved, more purposeful in relating to their grandchildren than were their grandparents that you and I knew. Their influence will spread beyond their own families. Growing up, I had a wonderful relationship with my grandparents. I love my grandparents. I could not imagine anybody not loving their grandparents. Going to visit my grandparents was the highlight of the week. Every Friday we would go and visit my grandmother and my grandfather. And not as frequently, we would also visit my grandmother on my father's side. But we had a strong relationship with our grandparents. I remember going to my grandparents' house, and the first thing we would do, we knew that Grandma had made things special for us all the time. We knew where the M&Ms were, we knew where the cookies were, we knew where the penny jar and our quarters were going to be. Everything was set up so that even if we did have to happen to miss a week, it would be ready for us the following week with double the pennies and double the quarters and everything else. It was the highlight of our week to be able to visit our grandparents. My grandparent on my mother's side, she had more British influence. And what I loved about going down there is that whenever I would go there, we would have tea. English breakfast tea with milk and sugar. Loved it. And both grandparents contributed something to my life. Grandparents have a very crucial role to play in bringing stability to children in times of difficulty. Grandparents have a very crucial role to play as far as being an advisor, a counselor, a mentor to children, to their grandchildren growing up. Grandparents can say something to a grandchild that a parent may not be able to say. A parent, a mother or a father may say something to a son or a daughter, and it may cause conflict, but somehow grandparents, they are able to convey the same thing, and the grandchild will listen. Grandparents love and provide in a different way for the children. A parent who thinks that either he or she can provide everything that the children need is sadly mistaken. Of course, parents have an influential role in their children's lives, perhaps the most important. But when you take a grandparent out of that child's life, you are actually amputating part of what that grandchild should know is that loving, strong relationship with a grandparent. One man put it like this: young people need something stable to hang on to, a culture of connection, a sense of their own past, a hope for their own future. Most of all, they need what grandparents can give them. So on June 14th, on the Grandparent Alienation Awareness Day, this is a day that grandparents throughout the country will be gathering together in various cities to bring this plight known to people around them. What's happening today is a phenomenon. It's been going on for a long time, but it seems to be increasing in intensity, and it seems to be finding more justification, sometimes even in the church. One man that I spoke to said that in his church, 23 sets of grandparents had been alienated from their grandchildren. Unfortunately, in many instances, the church says nothing. The church that should be encouraging family, the church that should be encouraging strong relationships between grandchildren and grandparents, say nothing. They have adopted a defective North American cultural point of view, which says that the family consists just of mother, father, son, and daughter, period. And in many instances, unfortunately, it may just be mother and children or father and children. Because with our broken culture today, in many instances, the children that need their grandparents the most may only have a single parent involved. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, and this is coming from the Old Testament, God says this: watch out. Be careful never to forget what you have seen. He's speaking to his people that he was leading into the promised land, and he said, do not let these memories escape from your mind as long as you live, and be sure to pass them on to your children and your grandchildren. From a biblical point of view, a family is more than just the nuclear family. In fact, the nuclear family is a relatively recent Western innovation, and we are now interpreting family according to this relatively new Western innovation. Throughout most cultures of the world, even today, family is much greater than mother, father, son, and daughter. Grandparents are involved. We have nurses from other countries that when the grandparents want to come and visit the grandchildren, it is the parents' responsibility to make sure that the grandparents can make it over to the United States. They have money to be here. They can stay as long as they want. They will take care of all of their needs. They need to be here because grandparents are so important to grandchildren. It is a defective North American culture which unfortunately is starting to affect and poison the church that says grandparents are not that important. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses says, these are the commands, decrees, and regulations that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you. You must obey them in the land you are about to enter and occupy. You and your children and your grandchildren must fear the Lord your God as long as you live. One of the things that grandparents should be doing is teaching not just their children but grandchildren how to fear God, how to love God. Psalm 103 verse 17 says, but the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to his children's children. In other words, the righteousness extends to the grandchildren. God is providing blessings to families through grandparents to the grandchildren. Psalm 128 says, may you live to enjoy your grandchildren. May Israel have peace. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said this about grandparents: what children need most are the essentials the grandparents provide in abundance. They give unconditional love, kindness, patience, humor, comfort, lessons in life, and most importantly, cookies. Proverbs 13 verse 22 says that grandparents should leave an inheritance to their grandchildren. Good people leave an inheritance to their grandchildren. Alex Haley wrote, nobody can do for little children what grandparents do. Grandparents sort of sprinkle stardust over the lives of little children. Proverbs 17 verse 6 says, grandchildren are the crowning glory of the aged. Victor Hugo wrote, there are fathers who do not love their children. There is no grandfather who does not adore his grandson. In Isaiah chapter 59 verse 21, God says this through the prophet Isaiah, as for me, this is my covenant with you, says the Lord, my spirit that is upon you, and my words that I have put in your mouth shall not depart out of your mouth, or the mouths of your children, or out of the mouths of your children's children, says the Lord, from now on and forever. In God's eyes, Grandparents have a responsibility not just to teach children, but the children's children. They have a responsibility to be with their grandchildren and to teach them. Joy Hargrove wrote the following: one of the most powerful hand clasps is that of a new grandbaby around the finger of a grandfather. Louisa Mary Alcott wrote this: every house needs a grandmother in it. There's an Italian proverb that says, if nothing is going well, call your grandmother. In the book of Job, chapter 42, verses 16 through 17, talks about Job. Job lived 140 years after that, living to see 4 generations of his children and grandchildren. 4 generations of his grandchildren. How blessed was he? Then he died, an old man who had lived a long, full life. Doug Larson says, few things are more delightful than grandchildren fighting over your lap. One man said, a grandfather is someone with silver in his hair and gold in his heart. The issue of grandparent alienation needs to be addressed not just in North America, but also in the church. Too often, we look at grandparents as being individuals, people that are unnecessary, maybe glorified babysitters. Deuteronomy chapter 4 says this: what makes us greater than other nations? We have a God who is close to us and answers our prayers. You must be very careful not to forget the things that you have seen God do for you. Keep reminding yourselves and tell your children and your grandchildren. Again, keep reminding yourselves and tell your children and your grandchildren. The reason this issue and topic is so important to me is because it's now been 3 years since I've been able to see my grandchildren, Cruz and Gideon Morgan. The whole thing happened because the wonderful agency of Children's Protective Services inserted themselves into a situation that they did not need to be in, and they threw me under the bus. They allowed me to take the blame for something that I had nothing to do with, as they well know. I've spoken directly with CPS Commissioner in Texas. His name is Hank Whitman. Almost 2 years ago, we spoke face to face. He promised to address the issue. Unfortunately, CPS Commissioner Hank Whitman has yet to do so. As a result, I have not seen my grandchildren, Cruz and Gideon Morgan, for over 3 years at this point. Prior to that, at times, Cruz and Gideon practically lived with us. My wife and I babysat them several times a week, up to 5 times a week. Occasionally it was just once or twice a week, but usually it was several times a week. Loved our grandchildren, they loved us. Anyway, the role of grandparents is very important. I hope that if you know a grandparent who was alienated, don't blame the grandparent. Usually it is a child or a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law who is putting conditions on the parent, dictating to the parent what he or she can't do. I've known of grandparents who were no longer allowed to see their grandchildren because they simply gave a child a French fry. How stupid and how selfish is that? You will destroy your children because of vindictiveness and malice toward a parent or a mother-in-law or a father-in-law. Grandparents need their grandchildren, but grandchildren also need their grandparents. Grandparent alienation is child abuse. Again, grandparent alienation is child abuse. When a parent kicks a grandparent out of the grandchild's life for no reason whatsoever or from stupid, frivolous reason, that is psychological child abuse. The grandchild who cannot speak for himself is wondering what happened to grandma, what happened to grandpa. And the child or the son-in-law or the daughter-in-law have to make up stories, have to make up lies about the grandparent in order to justify their unjustifiable actions. This is what Grandparent Alienation Awareness Day is all about. There are not just hundreds, there are thousands and thousands of grandparents throughout this country who are being affected by this, who cannot see their grandchildren simply because of a vindictive, malicious, selfish, self-absorbed child, son-in-law, or daughter-in-law, period. Now, some of you would like to say, well, of course there are some grandparents that deserve this. I will grant you there are some grandparents that deserve this. There are some parents that do not deserve their children. So it does not mean we take every child away from every parent because some parents don't deserve their children, nor do we deprive every grandparent from a grandchild simply because there are a few grandparents out there who don't deserve the relationship with the grandchildren. I think we should stop making excuses for self-centered, self-absorbed, selfish behavior. In Texas, the Attorney General's website talks about the importance of grandparents. And they say that grandparents are very important to the grandchildren. The website of the Attorney General, you can look it up, Attorney General, Texas, grandparents, talk about the role of grandparents, and yet in the same breath when they talk about how important grandparents are to the grandchildren, they say, but grandparents in Texas have no rights. You have grandparents that say, I'm afraid for what's going on with my grandchildren. I want to be there to protect them. I want to be there to make sure they're okay. You know what the great remedy is in the state of Texas? Grandparents, you can call Children's Protective Services. You see, Children's Protective Services has more rights when it comes to your grandchildren than an alienated grandparent does. An alienated grandparent could be arrested for seeing a grandchild, and CPS can insert itself into a house and take a look at the grandchildren and even remove the grandchildren from the house. This is what grandparents have to face. What do we do when we can't see our grandchildren? I've gone through this for the last 3 years. I still love my grandchildren, Cruz and Gideon Morgan. I have no idea how it's affected them. Those who thought that it was a good idea to throw me out of their lives, my daughter, for example. Anyway, June 14th, 2018, third annual Grandparent Alienation Awareness Day. June 14th, 2018 is the third annual Grandparent Alienation Awareness Day. Grandparent alienation is child abuse. Grandparent alienation is also elder abuse, but grandparent alienation is child abuse. Almost every single son or daughter, son-in-law or daughter-in-law who was alienating the grandchildren, keeping grandchildren from a grandparent, is involved in either elder abuse or child abuse. Now, in North America, we have wonderful things that we say. We talk about parental rights. The parent should be able to decide everything. Parents can be selfish as can be, but we must defend parental rights, even if it is destroying the kids and the grandkids. Grandparent alienation is child abuse and it's elder abuse. And until we as a society and until the church starts to preach on this sin, we're going to let the status quo go on. We're going to continue to allow our children and our grandchildren to suffer the consequences of not having a strong intergenerational relationship with their own grandparents who love them, who would do anything for them. We need to address this issue. If you are at a place where there is a grandparent alienation awareness event going on June 14th, 2018, please stop in. Please offer your support. Please call your legislator if you are in a state. Ask them to strengthen grandparent rights. Ask them to allow grandparents to to create legislation, to strengthen legislation, so that grandparents can be actively involved in their grandchildren's lives. Look at our society today. Look at how screwed up it can be, and tell me, don't try to tell me that the lack of grandparent contact does not cause part of that. Thank you.